Hi everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Bree Tribuna, and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you join our community this evening. We appreciate your support of the authors and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open right down at the bottom of Zoom, so feel free to make use of those. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a very strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any participant can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. So on to our authors this evening. I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. Phoebe Alston started writing in middle school, entertaining his classmates with horror stories starring the whole class where not everyone survived. After several years of trying to break into publishing, he had just been accepted into a biomedical graduate program when a chance entry into a Twitter pitch contest led to his signing with TBA, 20-plus book deals worldwide, and even a film deal. His newest work is an exhilarating debut middle-grade fantasy, the first in a trilogy filled with Black girl magic. Christina Hammonds Reed holds an MFA from University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts. A native of the LA area, her work has previously appeared in the Santa Monica Review and One Teen Story. Her first novel, The Black Kids, is an unforgettable coming-of-age story exploring issues of race, class, and violence through the eyes of a wealthy Black teenager whose family gets caught in the vortex of the 1992 Rodney King riots. Desmond Hall is a Jamaican-born writer. His debut novel, Your Corner Dark's title echoes a Jamaican phrase that refers to being stuck between a rock and a hard place with no good choice. Your Corner Dark is a fast-paced, riveting page-turner about choices, impossible odds, and perseverance. Dolores Johnson's writing examines American racism and identity, including essays published in the Buffalo News, Narratively, Hippocampus, Writers of Color Anthology, and elsewhere. Her 2020 memoir, Say I'm Dead, is the true story of family secrets, separation, courage, and transformation through 5 generations of interracial relationships. It received the Outstanding Literary Award from the National Association of Black Journalists and a starred review from the American Library Association's book list. Nancy Johnson, a native of Chicago's South Side, has worked for more than a decade as an Emmy-nominated, award-winning television journalist at CBS and ABC affiliates nationwide. The Kindest Lie, her first novel, captures the heartbreaking divide between Black and white communities and offers both an unflinching view of motherhood in contemporary America and the never-ending quest to achieve the American dream. Is that everyone? Did I get everyone? So welcome. I'm going to start with some questions, but audience members, please feel free, drop those questions down below. To start us off, with the intense focus on own voices storytelling, how important do you feel it is to cleave to your own experiences in your work versus looking outside of your own experiences beyond autobiography for marginalized experiences? Des, could you kick us off?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for making me go first.
You're right to my left, so it was very convenient.
No, but it's interesting. I have a couple thoughts on that. First, I think in my own work in fiction, I think you sort of use an amalgam of experiences as well as invention. And I can't tell you how many times I've taken some pages of a work that I'm working on, and I take it to my beloved and trusted writing group, and they tell me, Des, I don't believe it. And I'm like, well, that actually happened. It was like a real life story that I actually recounted, and it didn't resonate. And I think it's really important to not just tell true stories, but to dramatize them, to be able to make them resonate in a way where it feels really real, and it's almost realer than real life in the way that it makes, people react to the theme, thought, and the character's sort of journey. Then I also think with the second part of that question, I think of Frederick Douglass, and I think of a story with him. The 1800s American philosopher. He was called an abolitionist, but I think he was a philosopher. And he was given an opportunity by a white abolitionist to speak at an event, and it was actually a 4th of July event. And he was expected to speak about slavery alone. And Frederick Douglass was a massive thinker. And he spoke not just about slavery, but about many other things. And the white abolitionist was quite upset with him because he expected him to just, well, let's just say, stay in his lane. And, Frederick Douglass wasn't having any of that. And he spoke about many things. And he knew in advance that this would cause trouble. But, he wanted to talk about what he wanted to talk about. And he was more than qualified to do so. And I think, in the way you asked that question, I think, artists today, writers of color, should be able to write what they feel. And especially in a history that we've come from, where D.W. Griffith and his Birth of the Nation was a racist piece, even in a time when racism was widespread, but it was still hugely popular. And with that kind of a lens, I think writers of color have every right and opportunity right now, or should have every opportunity to write what they feel.
I just wanted to jump in. That Frederick Douglass story that you told, Des, it made me think about something that I heard the late Toni Morrison talk about in an interview, where she was asked by an interviewer, when are you going to start writing about white characters in your books? And she said, she paused and said, would you ever ask a white author when he was going to start writing Black characters? You're assuming that I'm not in the mainstream, and I am in the mainstream. And so I've always thought about that, as I approach my own work. But also to answer the question from a different lens, in my story, I am telling the story of an unlikely connection between a Black woman chemical engineer and this poor young white boy in this dying Indiana factory town. And some people have asked me, how do you tell a story from a white boy's point of view? I've never been white, I've never been a boy, but I have been 11 years old before. And I was certainly bullied as a kid, and I was able to take some of those experiences of being on the outside of things and infuse that into a character who is very different from me. And I also think just being Black in America and being in white spaces my entire life, in school and in the workplace, I'm very fluent in whiteness, but I think it's very different for white authors writing Black characters. Not that they should not do that, but I think they have to interrogate it a little more closely in terms of, am I the right person to tell the story? Why am I telling it? Am I doing it because I think diversity is trending right now? Or is there a real, legitimate reason for doing it, and making sure you're doing the research and really getting it right before you start to try to tell Black stories?
And
I'll jump in too. Is that all right?
You go first, and then I'll say what I have to say.
Okay, great. So the question was around whether or not Black authors should stick to their own experiences or reach outside of them. And I feel very strongly at this point in time, there's such a dearth of authentic Black literature in the American canon that it's really desirable for Black writers to write their authentic truth, to show what Black life is like, to express Black joy, give perspectives that haven't been given in any wide swath in America. Of course, every writer can choose whatever they want to write about, and I'm all for that, but I'd love to see a lot more Black authentic stories.
So I'm going to come in from a slightly maybe more militant perspective, and that's that I think there's an assumption that all of our books are autobiographical, and that's, I think, something that we face as writers of color, that every time we write something, it has to be autobiographical. And I don't see that same assumption made of white writers or other writers of color even sometimes. in terms of people assuming that whatever you write, it's your own experience. And so I think as much as we all aspire towards authenticity, as much as we're all drawing from our personal wells of experiences, as much as we want to put that on the page, I think it can be faulty to assume that it's us on the page, like that we are our characters, and there's always going to be pieces of ourselves in a novel. That's just kind of how writing works often, that there's some fragmented pieces of self throughout. But this idea that authors of color are always writing themselves, I think is kind of a problematic one that we have to examine and see why that assumption's always made, that we don't have the talent to come up with these worlds by ourselves.
I just finished up. For me, it was important to kind of draw from my own experiences because I come from a fantasy background and reading fantasy, writing fantasy, and for me, there just wasn't any fantasy stories about I'm sorry, my internet connection. Can you guys still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, I think flashed. Okay, yeah, but for me, there just wasn't any fantasy stories about a Black kid from my background. And so for me, it was really important to kind of put that on the page, and for kind of give kids that maybe weren't from those backgrounds a chance to empathize with a kid that they hear all these negative stereotypes about. And so that's why it was kind of important for me to do that, and that's kind of why hopefully I kind of continue to do that in the future too. So that's why it's important to me.
It actually leads really nicely into my next question, which is, how did your early experiences of storytelling shape the way you share your stories now, both fictional and autobiographical, and maybe in the fantasy space, especially, Phoebe?
I'm sorry, I lost you for a second. I think
Oh, that's okay.
Unstable.
How did your early experiences of storytelling shape the way you share your stories now?
Oh, definitely. I think so. For me, when I first started, because I wrote fantasy, there was and because there weren't any Black characters, like I really kind of got pressure, especially from my writing groups and writing friends, to not write Black characters because they weren't going to sell. And when you looked at the bookshelves, that kind of proved to be true, And so that was something I struggled with for a while. Was how much of myself to put into the book, how much of my background, the dynamics that I went through as a kid, how much would that translate onto the page, and what other people want to read that. And so kind of for me as the growth as a writer was just kind of learning to, kind of as my character, as she learns to accept herself, was me kind of learning to accept myself through my writing as well. And just finally got to a point where I just wanted to tell the stories that a kid like me would have wanted to read, and that would resonate with a kid like I was. And so I hope that's something I accomplished. I hope, like I said earlier, that not just for kids who's from my background, but maybe a kid who's never never met a kid from the hood or from the ghetto, as they call it, that they get to see that we're all people, that the stereotypes you see, that the stuff they tell you on the news, and the way we portray isn't always the truth. Most times it's not the truth, actually. And so that's kind of how I've grown as a writer, and how I hope to continue to grow even more in the future.
Does anyone else want to talk about their experiences of storytelling growing up and forming as a writer?
Yeah, I think I had similar experience to BB, just that, I grew up reading a lot of Nancy Drew mysteries, with my namesake, and I just loved those books. And it wasn't until much later in life, when I was an adult, that I look back on that and realized I didn't see anybody on the page who looked like me. So very similar, to you. I mean, I was, loved this community of River Heights that Nancy Drew was riding in her blue convertible in, but, there were not any Black people that were shown in that community. And so now I feel like I just have this awesome privilege to be able to share stories about people who look like me. And so hopefully when young people are, reading books that I've written, that they can see themselves in those books. And then also with storytelling, I'm a former journalist, and just in the news stories sometimes, that we would tell, certainly when I was reporting in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of times you saw Black people on the news, it was like a perp walk, or, there were so many negative images of Black people in the media. And so hopefully now with the kinds of stories I'm telling, there's more complexity and that we're seeing ourselves more fully and not just one image. Because I think the way we're portrayed, whether it's in the media or in literature, impacts so much about our communities in terms of how we're policed or where the grocery stores are or how we're educated. Just everything is impacted by media and the perceptions of who we are.
I guess to piggyback off of that, I was very fortunate. I grew up with parents who were very invested in our education and were themselves professionals and did everything possible to make sure we had books that looked like us, which was a little harder, but not as hard as it was many, many years ago. So my parents would go out of their way to bookstores to find books with Black faces and books that reaffirmed our identities. And I think that was a beautiful foundation to have set. But then as I kept reading, I wouldn't see those experiences reflected, or I would see experiences of Blackness that were around pathology or around violence or around the hood. And that wasn't my lived experience. I grew up middle to upper middle class, depending on who's framing it. And I didn't read stories about girls like myself. And I knew that we existed, and I knew that we're not a monolith, and that I think sometimes you want to interrogate why certain narratives keep being perpetuated or keep getting sold. And so for me, it was a matter of like, well, I want to write a coming of age story about a girl who grew up like me, who comes into her own Blackness and kind of subverts the internalized racism that exists. I think sometimes when you grow up in spaces where you're one of the few or one of the only Black people there.
Yeah. Well, to jump in with a slightly different angle, I look at my immigrant experience, and I was sort of a barrel child, which meant like I sort of went back and forth between New York and Jamaica several times before coming to New York. And at the time, my patois was so thick that, you know, I was warned not to speak at the embassy when I went for my passport, because they would say that I was dumb. And that, you know, back at that time, you know, perception was very important to get a visa and a passport. So I dummied up. And at one particular time, we moved to the so-called projects. And I remember holding my mom's hand and stepping over people sleeping in the hallway to get to our apartment. And with that, you know, we would, I would get in a lot of fights with the kids. This was a multi-ethnic project. And I'd get into a lot of fights about, mostly because I was Jamaican. And I think people didn't understand who I was. You know, they didn't know my experience. And, you know, as Nancy and Christina were saying, there were no, you know, creditable media source, no books, no media sources that represented Jamaicans. You know, they represented Jamaicans as Rastas, right? Right. You know, yeah, you know, like that. And, you know, that's a very small part of the Jamaican experience. And I think a lot of that, you know, held me back for a long time. I think my confidence to think that I could communicate was affected by that. I also think my thought pattern of having to make money, because I kind of knew in high school that I wanted to write, but I also felt this overbearing need to make money. I felt like I didn't have a right to be an artist, much less say the word artist. You know, there were so many people back home without shoes, without this, without that, that I needed to make some money, not just for myself, for status sake, but also to help people out back home. So that experience, I think I had a lot of overcoming to do in that respect.
I think what we're all saying is that we want the basic humanity that is afforded to white people in this country. We want to see our stories. We want them to be authentic. We want other people to know our stories, each of us in our own slice, whether it's how you grew up as a kid, or what you saw when you read as a kid, or your coming of age situation, or in my case, the interracial double whammy of racism, race and interracialism. We just want to be seen, to be understood, and have the opportunity to tell the stories, including the joy of what our lives are all about.
So my next question. Black storytelling is often framed in terms of white interest and white permission, whether it's through the media or through publishing or through any of these channels. What is publishing ready for? And what is the market for Black stories? And as if Black readers are a secondary consideration now, how can we move them to a primary consideration?
My hope is that Black stories are interesting to everybody, not just to Black readers. It's an important thing for white America to know about the minorities in this country and to respect their journeys as well. And, you know, unfortunately, publishing is a for-profit business, which means that if you have a gatekeeper who doesn't understand your minority story, they're not going to buy it. I had one agent tell me that, ask me after reviewing my material, who did I think the audience was for my story? And I said, I thought it was for everybody, because America has begun to move towards more acceptance of mixed race people. And we had Obama in the White House and Meghan Markle and Derek Jeter and Colin Kaepernick and all these people that are in the spotlight. And she said to me, well, no. Actually, race mixing is an unpleasant topic people wouldn't want to read about.
Oof.
And if we can't sell 30,000 copies at $20 a piece, we wouldn't be interested in buying your book. That's about as blatant as it goes. So, you know, there's a long way for publishing to go, but there were some breakthroughs last summer when Dana Kennedy was named the publisher of Simon & Schuster's. That's a Black woman who vowed to change those kinds of stories within Simon & Schuster and hopefully the publishing industry. And then because of all of the offshoots from the police brutality issues around George Floyd's death, people were talking about health disparities and economic disparities, but also there was something called What Publishing Paid Me. And Jessamine Hope, who has Jessamine Ward, who has won 2 National Book Awards, told how after she won the first National Book Award and she came back with another book, the publishers offered her $20,000 as an advance, which many debut white authors were getting hundreds, if not $500,000 and up for their first books. And she fought and fought. And she exposed that because it was another form of discrimination against minority stories and minority authors. And then it opened up the floodgates, and many other minority authors told their stories of how they were getting substandard pay for a national award-winning material. So, you know, publishing is a difficult world to jump into when you have your hard-won story on the page and they don't want to listen.
And I think I heard recently, it was somebody talking about racism specifically, and they were saying that, and I forget who it was somebody very, very famous, but they were saying they always ask Black people, what can we do, or what can we do about racism? But you don't hear that same question asked of white people. So it's always almost like Black people have to solve the problem, but it's not a problem of our creation. And yesterday there was this thing that was circulating the rounds about FK Twigs talking about her abusive relationship with Shia LaBeouf. And she was saying how people are always asking, why didn't you leave? And as opposed to asking the abuser, why did you keep abusing me? So I think that's something that, for me, I think a lot of times in panels and everywhere, we get asked these questions like, what can publishing do? But I think there's a lot of self-reflection and interrogation that needs to happen within publishing in terms of the people in charge, in terms of them making space, because let's face it, right now, we are still not the people in power. And in terms of just sort of readers as well, saying, okay, well, why is it that I may or may not buy this book? And I think that sometimes it's a challenge to the readers to say, well, if I'm only reading books by people like me, what can I do to solve this? So it's a multifold answer, but I think sometimes there's such an emotional burden put on Black people to tell people what to do, as opposed to people looking within themselves and saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe I need to diversify my shelves. Maybe I need to make space for somebody in this company. Maybe I need to like think about how I view what is considered literature and what's not. So I feel like that question is very multi-layered in that way.
Interesting when you mentioned Christina, the readers, because I found this is my first book, my first novel, The Kindest Lie. And so, I've had people that I know, authors, white authors, say, oh, we've got a reading group where we're going to be reading like Black books, or we're doing our anti-racism reading. So, we're going to include yours, like they're doing me a favor there because I'm part of the anti-racism reading, or you're part of our Black History Month, reading. Or, I'm really trying hard, and that's what people will tell me. I'm trying very hard to read Black books. I'm thinking our stories are just as great and, just as beautiful as anybody else's, but there seems to be this extra effort that has to be made to read our books, which is constantly otherized in that fashion. And just to go to the question that you were asking, Bree, I just think we can't really ask for the permission to tell our stories. I think we just have to tell them and not wait for publishing to be ready, because I don't know when or if publishing will really be ready, but we have to keep creating the work and putting the work out there.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Let me just add a slightly different angle. I was at the Quelle conference a couple of years ago, and there were some editors there, and they were some white editors who were saying they've hired editors, junior editors of color, for them to actually see books and bring in stories that they consider to be different. And it was an interesting thing to think about, because in many industries, I used to be in the advertising industry and as well as a teacher. And I think many times efforts are made where people of color are quote unquote brought in, but then not given the power to make the change, to make the call themselves. So going back to these, junior editors of color, it means nothing if they're brought in and then not given the agency to actually greenlight books that they resonate with and think will resonate with readers. And then comes the question of, is the advertising and marketing put there as well? I think, to jump to the film industry, because this just goes together, Anna DuVernay has started a database for Black artists in the, let's say, artists of color in the film industry, as well as crew, to be found and to be brought to white decision makers, because it's almost a cliche to hear from white studio execs that they can't find anyone. They have tried to find people of color. So, kudos to Miss DuVernay. She has created this database with their money, and to put the artists right there with great credentials, riggers that have worked on massive productions with great experience, screenwriters who have written amazing pieces. Well, now they're there, and now the onus, as Christina said, as Nancy said, is now on the studio execs, which I see as the way forward. To be able to create a structure where the names and the voices are there, and then the spotlight becomes, are you going to greenlight these people? Are you going to hire these people? Are you going to give these people a chance to put their work out in the world? And that, for me, is going to be a way forward.
feel like it's almost, I was in a conference and we were talking about this, where you're putting the cart before the horse. If you're hiring or for diversity only without giving them power and making a safe space, right? So yeah, I think it's definitely an internal struggle for publishing, which is so white internally, to make a safer space for Black authors, Black stories, but also for Black employees in publishing, Black editors, Black designers, Black executives, just top to bottom, so that it's not reading Black authors, making an effort to do that, making an effort to shop small Black-owned businesses. It's just reading, it's just shopping, you're supporting artists, right? Rather than having to feel like you need to go out of your way to support Black artists. It's part of your discourse. So my next question. Many people are turning to reading as a comfort and escape during the pandemic. What have you all been reading, and do you have any recommendations for the audience? I normally save recommendations to the end, but I'm mixing it up tonight.
Sure, I have a couple. So these are, since I'm a debut author, I want to promote other debut authors. I think it's great. This is Wild Women and the Blues by Denny S. Bryce. And I've read this. I've read an advanced copy of it. It comes out in March. So next month. and it highlights Jazz Age Chicago. And it's got, the racketeering and the music and the bootleg whiskey. And it's just a beautiful piece of work. And so I highly recommend this one by Denny S. Bryce. And then the other one that I have an advanced copy of, people have probably seen this one around, is The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Delilah Harris. And so it comes out in June. So you'll be hearing and seeing a lot more about this particular book. And it's actually set in the publishing industry and highlights two Black editorial assistants in publishing. And it's a thriller, and so one is there, and then, she's like, oh, I'm the only one here. I wish I had somebody else. And then the other Black girl shows up, and it's like, ooh, the other Black girl shows up, And so it's that thriller type that's being compared to a cross between the movie Get Out and The Devil Wears Prada. So look for this one in June.
I've been reading some other minority authors and getting a good perspective across groups that have been either colonized or subject to racist government, such as we have had here in the United States. So V.S. Naipaul, who's a Trinidadian writer in the House on Miguel Street. Salman Rushdie, East West, is about East Indians in India, and then again in London with their colonists, former colonists. And then I've been reading Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and it was my very first horror movie. I usually don't want anything to do with sci-fi or horror, but it was very eye-opening how prescient she was around the issues that we live with today, but forefronting Black people in the story.
I also read Parable of the Sower back in August, and this year was either very much the year to read it or very much not the year to read it. It's an amazing book, though.
Oh,
All right.
a couple
Yeah, of course.
First probably Legendborn. I'm sorry, I'm big into fantasy, so that's usually what I read, and that's by Tracy Dion. And this is a really cool take on kind of Arthurian legends and kind of being the Black person in a white space and kind of navigating that. And then the other is probably Tristan Strong. It's another middle grade, kind of like what I write. Except this one's on kind of African folklore and myths, and I think it's just a really cool way to kind of get that across to young readers who may not be exposed to it in any other kind of way. So.
Yes, I'll go.
Yeah,
I read Aftershocks, I don't know where, oh, here it is. I'm gonna knock everything over just to show it to you guys. So Aftershocks is this really beautiful memoir by Nadia Owusu, and she is a biracial woman. She's half African, half Armenian, and it's kind of her coming of age story. Her mother left them when she was very young, her mother who was the Armenian one, and it's really about her navigating her biracial identity and nationality because her father was a UN representative, so they were moving all around, and just sort of her figuring out where she belongs as a woman, as a biracial person, as just somebody in this earth, as a motherless child to a certain extent. So that's like a really beautiful memoir. And I also just finished my friend Namina's book, The Gilded Ones, which is very badass and feminist, and you should absolutely read it. YA, that one's YA.
We hosted her the other night. I'm so excited for that book.
It's very good, and she's lovely.
Well, I'm going to do the plug for everyone here. Everyone should get everyone's book. Order right now. Click, and buy.
I'll be dropping a link in the chat at the end of tonight. So
I can't wait. I haven't read anyone's book here yet, but I can't wait. I've ordered them all. I'm reading Nancy's right now.
I can see my book in the background there.
Oh yeah. And I have my placeholder in it. It's so thick and amazing. Oh. And it's the density of goodness, Nancy. Respect. You know, you out of the ballpark.
Thank you. Can't wait to dive into Your Corner Dark. So
you better.
I will. And I'll call you. We'll talk about it.
Okay. And I can't wait to read Dolores's book, BB's, as well as Christina's. And I think everybody watching, you should order them now and check them out. I am.
So I would actually love, we've talked about other people's books. I would love to talk about your books now. I wonder, Christina, could you start us off with talking about setting and how important place is in a story, and whether when you're writing, is LA a character and does it help shape the story?
So in my book, LA is the setting is very much a character. And I think partially because we don't get a lot of literature set in LA. And a lot of times when LA is portrayed on screen, it's very reductive. It's either like you get Beverly Hills and palm trees, or you get the hood, and you don't get everything that's in between. And LA is it's such a diverse place, ethnically, geographically. People don't realize that South LA is right next to some of the wealthiest parts of the city. And you can drive down certain places in LA where like there will be really rundown apartment homes, and then you cross the block and there are $20 million houses. So I think that just wanting to reflect LA as I know it, and that especially during the riots, this idea that we were all very much connected in what was happening, it was something that as a city we were all grappling with. And I think some people were having to really examine themselves, and other people were wondering why things had gotten so bad. Like it just, for me in that particular book, setting is everything, just because it's so important to understanding the riots and understanding where Ashley's coming from and how she can feel very disconnected from what's going on in her own backyard. Because if you are in some of these privileged places, you don't have to drive into South LA, you don't have to drive into downtown. And so you don't necessarily feel as connected as you can until something huge like this happens, which sort of brings everybody together in a way that when I told people I was writing a book about the LA riots, a lot of people older than me who remembered them very vividly across class backgrounds were like, I remember trying to rush home and hoping that blah, blah, blah. Like one lady told me about rushing home in her BMW, and somebody else told me how he had just moved to the city and from Guatemala and was like, well, what the hell is going on here? And other people had to be rushed into their homes because they were school children and the riots were underway and they lived in South LA. So I think LA is, I can't even disconnect LA from the story in the Black kids. It's so important to it.
Setting wasn't as important to me from a physical point of view as what Christina is describing, because the story moves from Indiana to Buffalo to New York City to South Carolina to Baton Rouge to France to Boston.
Oh,
But the character of setting that I can talk about is the socioeconomic, the political, the norms, and culture that forms the backdrop of telling a personal story about how those factors are carried through in the lives of the people in the story. So it was really important for me to be able to talk about the laws, the codes, the police, the opportunity, the suppression of access and opportunity as a character. Like, look at what society has wrought, was what I was trying to show.
mm, mm,
And in my novel, I start off in Chicago, which is my hometown. I'm born and raised in the South Side. And I talk in the book in the beginning about how people, well, mainly white people, a lot of times they don't ever get to the South Side unless they're just passing through, or you're like on the train, the L train or something going through, and you're not stopping and knowing what the South Side is about. And I think there's so many misconceptions on the news about the South Side of Chicago, and people think everybody is dodging bullets at all times. And so I just wanted to show another perception or another experience of what the South Side of Chicago was like. And I do that through my main character. But most of my book is taking place in Ganton, Indiana. And I've had readers tell me that they thought that Ganton was a real place. They've Googled it, but it's fictitious. It's a, just part of my imagination, really. And so it's a small factory town where the auto plant, which was the beating heart of that town, has been shuttered. It's closed. And, so I make that environment so real because that's really speaks to the environment and the socioeconomic situation that the people are in, and the racial tensions are just, inflamed even more, I think, because they're in this close-knit community where they've lost that auto plant, which was the livelihood, for so many people there. So definitely for me, I think the setting of Ganton, Indiana is a character in the book for me.
so yeah, so that's cool. I like because I've studied. I come from sort of a film background into writing, and one of the things that's always used is image systems. Directors spend time coming up with visual cues that help tell the story. And like David Fincher in the movie Seven, he uses water because water is essential to the body. And we have murders, and the water is always dripping, leaving. In Casablanca, it's about being, trapped. So there's often like images of prison, bars, stripes, the shadows, people wearing striped clothes, the searchlight going across constantly in the background. And in my novel, Your Corner Dark, I use a lot of my protagonist wants to study engineering, and it becomes it becomes very doubtful that he'll get there. But I keep putting in the background and noting structures and the significance of structures and how they are created to sort of remind people, at least subconsciously and a bit consciously, that this is his external goal. And I think when using these image systems, it adds to the story in terms of setting, because of course we use imagination, we use research, but to actually consciously think about our themes and use these images and purposefully plant them along the way, whether readers get them or not, I think it plays subconsciously and can really add to the story.
So in my story, Amari is kind of the poor kid who gets the scholarship at the rich school, and for her, her relationship with her setting is kind of a love-hate relationship, in that she kind of feels a lot of the stereotypes that come along with being from that area. And so, and then her mom is always saying that, you know, she wants you to leave, you know, do better for yourself, you know, leave this area. And so she's kind of got a built-in level of, you know, kind of a shame of, you know, oh, I come from this place that, you know, I don't like other people to know about. And then over the course of the story, she has to kind of learn that, you know, yeah, my goal is to maybe leave here one day, but it's not something to be ashamed of. Like, they're good people here. You know, this place made me who I am today. And so I think just in terms of how she interacts with her setting and how she comes to view it differently, it kind of acts, you know, as a character and somewhat in that way, just in how she kind of learns to view it differently and how it changes her. That's kind of how I think it kind of applies to that.
So my next question, I warned you guys that I just peppered some of my own personal favorite questions in here. What is your writing process like? Do you write linearly from beginning to end, or do you have a few key scenes stuck out in your mind clearly that you write first and then build around? Nancy?
I definitely write more linearly. I mean, I may change that on the second book. I don't know. But it's not like I think of a scene and it might be 2/3 of the way in the book and I write it now and just see where it fits in later. I write it, you know, just from beginning to end, at least for the first draft is the way I approach it. But I will say another part of the writing process, I work a full-time job. And so I have a long commute, an hour and a half each way, and it's a driving commute, not a train commute. Wow. So it seems like I'm always thinking about the book and so some of the best ideas, you know, for dialogue or exposition, they come to me when I'm on the interstate and I can't write them down. And I always think when I get to work, I'll remember, you know, what it was I was thinking. And of course, when I get to work, I forget it. I don't remember a thing. So what I started doing was using the, you know, the voice memo function on my phone. And so as I'm driving on the interstate, I talk into my phone, you know, the things that I want to say in the book. And then I go back later, you know, and just transcribe that. And also, I would say coming from a television journalism background, I'm accustomed to writing for the ear. And so part of my process too for writing is I go back to my manuscript. You know, each day I look back at what I wrote the day before and I read it aloud, the scene aloud, and I listen for, you know, the rhythm and the cadence. How does that sound to me? And I can tell if there are some discordant notes or something is not working. So that's another part of how I approach it.
When I was writing Say I'm Dead, I had a difficult time figuring out the structure of the book. And after doing several drafts and still not quite having it with a through line that I wanted, I started to write each scene on an index card. Mm-hmm. And I was able to put them on a push pin board, and I could see whether this should be a flashback and move it over here or whatever. So that gave me the structure. And so now I'm working on a second book and I'm doing the same thing. And that is, I've got index cards of different colors. Each color is for a different character. And on that, each card is a scene. So I have a guidepost as to where my book is going. I don't know what order it will be put in. Right now I'm writing it linearly, but I'm already planting the seeds for what I think will come later. But revision is such a huge part of your final product that it really almost doesn't matter whether you jump around or you go linearly, because it's all going to change so many times before you finish the product. But I find the cards help me organize my thoughts.
Those cards remind me of Scrivener too, what a lot of people use. I've never been able to master that, so I'm all in Word, but I don't know if other people use Scrivener or something similar.
I haven't, but I heard it was good.
I just started using Scrivener and I'm finding it really helpful. But like Desmond, I come from a film background, so I tend to outline according to how screenplays are structured. And so I tend to think of things in acts, and I tend to think of things in terms of like inciting incidents and rising action and blah, 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 blah. And so that helps me get it down on the page in terms of what I think my story is going to be. But as soon as I start writing, it just might as well be a free for all. So I have like the general ideas in terms of like, this is going to be a moment that builds towards whatever. But once I'm actually in it, not so much. And I do a lot of writing on my phone at like 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep. I'm just like, I came up with something. Let me like text this in the dark to myself. And I miss commuting. The pandemic has been so bad for my writing because I am like somebody who constantly thinks of story as I'm driving, and with LA traffic, you're like always driving. So now I'm like trying to recreate that just walking around. It's not quite as good.
And like Christina, I am a citizen of story structure. And Christina, you might know the Robert Mckees story class.
Mhm.
I've taken it 3 times.
Oh my goodness.
It's a 3-day, 10-hour class, and I have rewritten the notes. I've studied it upside down. So for me, if without story structure, I would not be able to write. I don't know how people do it by pantsing. I have incredible respect for that. I need the story structure in order to tell my stories. And, that idea of putting your character in successive, difficult situations where they have to make choices to reveal their true character, because, we know talk is cheap, is what I live by. And without it, I feel lost.
Yeah, I'm probably definitely the same way. I kind of live or die by the story structure. For me, it was the Blake Snyder, the beat sheets. I love those. So I get my basic beats, the big moments, and then I'll kind of write in between. And like Christina said, obviously, I mean, it'll change 100% of the time. It changes, but just to have a certain like guidepost, knowing like, okay, I need to get to here eventually. Like I might, take 3 detours to get there, but I'm going to get there eventually, And so that's been huge for me. And man, I'm stealing your because I've had a phone all this time. I've never thought to use it for memos.
Voice
So I'm
memo.
going to definitely steal that, Nancy.
Okay.
So my next writing question, if you could write one episode of any TV show you're picking, what would it be? This is my favorite question to ask.
All right, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
The Wire. I loved The Wire and the way it brought humanity to law and order, so to speak. And it brought in the political, brought in the social, clearly the personal. It was sort of everything. And in a way, when I was writing Your Corner Dark, I thought about The Wire and I thought about Clockers by Richard Price, because there's something really visceral about crime, and the way you can bring in so much about humanity and civilization and social structures and comment on it is just raw. And I really would have loved if I could get in my time machine and work on the staff of writing The Wire. That's the only time I go back in the past.
Season 4 of The Wire just made me bawl, like every single episode. It's so masterfully written, like every single. Yes, I agree with you on that. I feel like there's so much good television on right now, though, that it's so hard to choose. That's like making you pick your babies, because there's so many thoughtful storytellers like at work now.
Wait, this is my favorite question.
I know. I think I would go with I May Destroy You. I think I would go with that. It's done now, but I would have loved to have been on that writing staff, I think, if I were to go with like a recent one.
And for me, I think just in terms of the kinds of stories that I love telling, in terms of for novels, for me, it would be Queen Sugar. Just love the beauty of the setting and just the pacing of it and how it takes its time, with getting to know the community and the characters. And yeah, I love the family dynamics, the relationships. So yeah, that's definitely one that I would want to write for.
Phoebe, you're thinking hard. What have you got?
I don't know, maybe something fun, maybe something like Insecure. Maybe that's just such a fun show. But Easter, he does such a good job already. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can ever top that, you know. So I don't know. That's tough.
I really like the story of Madam C.J. Walker. I think it was called On Her Own. And I liked it because not only did it show how she brought herself up from nowhere to living next door to the Rockefellers, but having had a long career in tech in corporate America, I like the business angle on it. I really loved that. So that would have been for me to write on that show.
Nice. So we have just a couple of minutes left. So I wonder, to close out the hour, could you all give us a preview of what we can expect from you next? I know you're working on new books, new projects, and I know the audience would love to hear about it. Dolores, can you start us off? I know you're working on your next book, right?
Yeah, I've started another book, and it's going to be historical fiction. So I spent about 4 months reading research material. There's a certain collection available at a university that I was given opportunity to get into dissertations, articles, books, all kinds of academic writing in order to create a knowledge base so that I can write a world. And so I've just got a couple of chapters under my belt. It takes place in New England.
Well, you know, it's funny. A lot of people are saying, it's one of the greatest things in your life to, you know, have your book launch, right? You must be crazy happy about it. And I was, but even happier was that my editor, who is a very tough cookie, liked the first draft of my second book. I had a beer that night.
You earned it.
It's called Barrel Girl, and it's based on Barrel Girl is a phrase coined by a Jamaican psychologist for kids who are left by their parents, either on their own if they're old enough, or with family or friends of family, while the parents go to the so-called first world to make more money in a couple years than they can in 10 years on the island. And the thing about barrel children is they're not expected to complain about the loss of their parents because they get a barrel. And, you know, for folks that don't know what a barrel is, it's like a 4 foot tall, 2 foot or so wide container that people, you know, Caribbean people in the first world loaded up with everything from designer jeans, sneakers, rice, cooking oil, and send back home. So everybody back home says, hey, you know, you have a barrel. So, you know, you really shouldn't complain about anything. We don't have a barrel. And, you know, these kids would probably trade 20 barrels if they could get their parents back. So it's a literary thriller, I'm told. And what was exciting was in the research, to follow up with what Dolores was saying, I got an opportunity through a friend of a friend to talk to some specialists in the area of crime, which was just eye-opening. And I was like, can I write that? Am I allowed to say that? Like, yes, that's not, it's not classified. So I'm like, cool. So I'm really psyched about that one. I think it's really exciting, and it has a lot of plot twists. And I think plot twists that'll really hit people. So I'm psyched about it right now.
Nice. Phoebe, what do you have for us? Are you working on, how far are you into the trilogy?
I'm working on book 2 right now.
Nice.
So that's consuming all my time at the moment. And then I also wrote a short story for an anthology called Black Boy Joy. It's gonna be like kind of for middle grade readers. And it's just, you know, just kind of giving a different aspect of, you know, like I was saying earlier, just a different way to look at, you know, young Black boys and what you get in the media and society sometimes. It's got a lot of Black male and male identifying kids writers, and I'm really excited about that too.
Awesome. Nancy?
So I'm about 3 chapters into a new novel, also dealing with issues of race, class, and family. which, I think readers have come to expect and hopefully enjoy in The Kindest Lie. So it's in a similar vein, but certainly a different time period, earlier time period, more historical time period than The Kindest Lie, which is set in 2008. So that's about all I can say about it right now. So stay tuned.
Christina, our grand finale.
Oh, I'm working on a historical fiction set in like the well, it's kind of an epic, but 60s through present, about a family trying to be like the Jackson Five, and specifically looking at the sort of the Black pursuit of the American dream through entertainment, and what gets taken from a lot of those performers, and what they give of themselves, and just kind of how that can fragment the individual, how that can fragment families. And there's kind of a connection to even further back history with minstrelsy. So we'll see if I can pull that off. I'm still like, I'm 60,000 words in and I still don't know if I'm going to pull it off.
Is that going to be adult, Christina?
It's going to be adult, yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. And as I predicted, I didn't make it through all of our questions. I feel like we could keep talking all night, but this is a really amazing event. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Oh, everyone in
you.
the audience is saying thank you too. Thank you to our great audience. I did drop all of our links for our authors' books tonight in the chat. So definitely, I know everyone's looking forward to reading them. Thank you.
Great.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.